Have you ever spent years building something for people who swore they valued you, only to have them call you outdated the moment a new face walks in? Have you ever watched someone try to replace you with buzzwords, ego, and blind confidence, only to realize they just fired the one person holding their entire empire together? Because that happened to me. And the way everything collapsed afterward still feels like a movie scene they never saw coming. So let me ask you this. What do you think happens when a company forgets who built its foundation? What do you think unfolds when a leader mistakes loyalty for weakness, experience for irrelevance, and the architect for expendable labor? And do you believe a person should walk away quietly or claim the value they earned? Now, let me take a breath and bring you into my world. This is not just a story about getting fired. It is a story about underestimation, ownership, accountability, and the quiet strength that people only notice when it is gone. And if you have the time, I would like you to listen. Really listen. To how everything unfolded, and how the moment they pushed me out became the moment I discovered what I was truly worth. My name is Harper Quinn. I am 37 years old, born in Boulder, Colorado, and for the last 13 years I served as the chief platform engineer behind Orion Core, the software that carried the entire company on its back. On the morning everything changed, I walked into the office thinking it would be another day of debugging, planning updates, and carrying a system that generated more than $600 million a year. Instead, I was told the new chief executive officer wanted to see me immediately, and something in the assistant's voice made the air feel heavier than usual. When I stepped into Lance Mercer's office, he did not invite me to sit. He barely looked at me. He folded his hands like a man rehearsing a speech he did not understand. "Harper, we need new energy. You are brilliant, but outdated." That one word hit harder than if he had said nothing at all. Outdated. That was the label he placed on me, the woman who had written the first line of Orion Core code in a cramped rented workspace back when the company could not afford decent coffee. I built the architecture, the security layers, the container orchestration, the automation pipelines, every hidden mechanism that made the platform stable enough to scale into government contracts and international partners. Yet he dismissed me as if I were a dusty manual shoved in a drawer. I waited for an explanation, maybe a hint of respect, but Lance only smiled, shallow and hollow, like a man checking off a task on his morning list. He spoke 6 minutes in total. Not a thank you, not an acknowledgement, not even a shred of awareness of what he was losing. He handed me the severance packet like it was a parking ticket and said he was making room for fresh innovators. That was the moment the first spark of resentment curled behind my ribs, quiet but certain, because I knew something he did not know. The man firing me had just thrown a match onto a fuse he could not see, and the consequences of that decision would come back to him sooner than he ever expected. I walked out of Lance's office without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction, keeping my face calm even though my pulse thudded like a drum under my skin. The hallway felt strangely quiet, as if the building itself understood what had just happened but was too stunned to speak. I reached my office, closed the door gently, and let myself breathe for the first time since he said the word outdated. That word echoed in my head while I stared at the familiar space I had poured 13 years of my life into. My desk, my whiteboard scribbles, my models of Orion Core's early architecture, all waiting for instructions I would never give again. Instead of anger, a sharp, cold clarity settled over me. They had no idea what they had just done. I pulled out a cardboard box the HR team left leaning against my chair, but I barely filled half of it. No sentimental trinkets, no heavy stacks of old documents. I took my jacket, my stainless steel water bottle, and my personal laptop which held nothing work-related. Then my eyes drifted to the navy blue folder sitting in the corner of my bottom drawer. It looked almost unimportant from the outside, worn at the edges from being moved around over the years. But inside it lived the one thing that tied everything back to me, the foundation the company had forgotten I built. I slid the folder into my bag without hesitation. That binder was not company property. It was the receipts of their oversight. As I walked through the office for the last time, people watched me quietly, some with confusion, some with sympathy, and a few with fear because they knew how much of the system relied on my hands. I did not offer explanations. I did not need to. I pressed my badge to the exit scanner, heard the familiar chime, and stepped into the parking lot with the severance packet crumpled in my hand and the navy blue folder secure at my side. They believed I was leaving empty, but the truth was the opposite. I was walking away with the one thing they should never have overlooked, and the consequences of that mistake were already in motion. In the quiet of my car, I set the navy blue folder on the passenger seat and let my fingers rest on it for a moment, feeling the weight of everything it represented. Most people in that building had no idea how Orion Corps truly began. They joined after the funding rounds, after the government contracts, after the world started calling us one of the fastest-growing platforms in the country. But I remembered the early days clearly. Because I was there when it was nothing but ambition, caffeine, and barely functioning equipment. Back then, we did not even have a legal department big enough to handle intellectual property structures, so the founders asked me, the only one who understood the architecture deeply enough, to temporarily house the core system under a small holding entity until the final paperwork could be drafted. That entity was called North River Labs, and I filed it myself. The plan was simple. Once the company stabilized, once the investors stopped breathing down our necks, once the product had a home, the IP would be formally transferred. Except that never happened. Everyone got busy. Priorities shifted. Departments expanded, and as the years passed, the oversight sunk deeper beneath new layers of leadership until it became invisible. Invisible to everyone except me. The folder contained the original agreements, the proof of ownership, the system registration keys, and the authentication rights tied to my name alone. For 13 years, I waited for someone to realize the transfer had not been completed. No one did. Not even Lance. I opened the folder briefly, scanning the stamped signatures and dated contracts, and felt a slow, controlled anger tighten in my chest. They called me outdated, but the entire platform still ran not only on the code I wrote, but on the legal foundation tied directly to me. As long as those documents existed, the heart of Orion Corps remained in my hands. I closed the folder, exhaled, and started the car. They thought they ended something today. They did not realize they had just activated the system's most powerful fail-safe. Me. Driving home, I tried to let the numbness settle, but my phone began vibrating nonstop on the passenger seat. Unknown numbers, frantic text bubbles, missed calls from former teammates who would never dare say too much over a corporate device. I ignored all of it and focused on the road until I reached my driveway. I parked, carried the navy blue folder inside, and set it gently on the kitchen table. For a moment, I simply stared at it, knowing that inside those papers lived the quiet truth the company had ignored for over a decade. I made tea, sat down, and promised myself I would not think about any of it until morning, but the universe had other plans. Less than 48 hours after my termination, everything started to break. At first, it was a single text from Tomas, short and cautious. Harper, clients cannot log in. Then another. Authentication loops failing. Then, systems rejecting updates. Have you seen this? I had. Not directly, but I understood exactly what was unfolding. Orion Corps' security protocols were not passive. I designed them to verify ownership on a recurring cycle, a safeguard created in the early years to prevent hostile acquisition attempts. Every 72 hours, the Corps checked for a valid license holder. When my credentials were deactivated, the system registered it as a potential breach, not an administrative change, and when it could not locate the authenticated owner, it did what it was engineered to do. It locked down. By the third day, I heard from a friend in infrastructure who risked a private message on her personal phone, Entire clusters were shutting off access. Government dashboards were timing out. Hospitals using Orion Core for data traceability were having to switch to manual logs. The system did not crash. It defended itself, and just as designed, it followed the protocol exactly. Without me, the platform refused to open its doors. I sat at my table in the dim kitchen, hands wrapped around a cooling mug, and realized the fuse had officially reached the powder. They thought they fired an engineer. What they actually removed was the key to their entire digital empire. By the time the third morning rolled around, the situation inside the company had shifted from confusion to full-scale panic, and I could tell without even stepping foot in the building. My phone lit up with messages I chose not to answer, but the notifications alone painted a clear picture. Critical failure. System unresponsive. Need insight ASAP. Even Lance's assistant sent a desperate email asking if I would be willing to offer guidance as a former team member. I almost laughed at the phrasing. They did not need guidance. They needed the truth they had ignored. Inside the office, chaos was unfolding in a rhythm I knew all too well. Updates were being rejected. Server clusters were cycling in protective modes. Failover nodes were refusing to assume control. Orion Core was not malfunctioning. It was executing the exact protective measures I built into it. And because Lance never bothered to learn the architecture, he had no idea what was actually happening. Word reached me through a friend that he had marched into the operations room carrying a cup of coffee and a list of buzzwords he planned to try like magic spells. Clear the local caches. Try a soft reboot. Push the previous build version. None of this mattered because the core was locked at a level no one but the authenticated owner could even view. I could imagine the scene with perfect clarity. Tomas hunched over his monitor, jaw clenched, silently praying Lance would step back before making things worse. Engineers flipping through old documentation that might as well have been written in a foreign language to them. Executives pacing behind them, demanding answers they were not trained to give. And somewhere in that room, Lance offering hollow reassurance while sipping cold coffee, pretending he had a handle on the situation. Their solution was to press buttons I had already accounted for. Every attempt to override the lockout protocol only deepened the system's defensive posture. They were treating a legal and ownership-based shutdown like a technical glitch, and their ignorance was costing them by the minute. I watched it all unfold from my quiet living room, not with joy, but with a steady, cold awareness. This was not revenge. This was cause and effect. When you remove the architect, do not be surprised when the foundation refuses to stand. While Lance scrambled to reboot servers, he did not understand. The legal department finally realized this was not a technical hiccup, but something far more serious. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a number I recognized immediately, even though I had never saved it. Dr. Elena Voss. The company's general counsel, a woman who never reached out unless the situation had already crossed into existential territory. I let the phone ring until it stopped, and seconds later, a text appeared. It was only 3 words, but they told me everything. Clause 9.4. Urgent. I sat back in my chair, letting the message settle like an old truth resurfacing from deep water. Clause 9.4 was part of the early contract tied to the Orion Core prototype. It clearly stated that until the intellectual property transfer was formally executed, full ownership, including authentication keys, licensing rights, and system resets, remained with the originating author, T. That clause had sat untouched for over a decade, buried under new layers of leadership and forgotten entirely by those who only knew the company in its polished, post-funding form. But the moment my credentials were revoked, the system performed a license verification check, found no legal owner authenticated, and triggered a lockout protocol that could not be overridden by anyone but myself. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. And the legal team had finally figured it out. Inside the company, Elena must have been tearing through ancient files, piecing together a timeline that pointed directly back to Lance's negligence. As I imagined her expression shifting from confusion to dread, I felt a mix of satisfaction and something heavier, something close to disappointment. They had years to fix this. Years to update the transfer paperwork. Years to acknowledge the foundation I built. Instead, they chose shortcuts, assumptions, and a CEO who believed buzzwords could replace understanding. The next message arrived minutes later. Please contact me. Critical situation. I put my phone face down on the table and exhaled slowly. It was clear what was happening. The crisis was no longer a technical emergency. It had become a legal catastrophe. The board, the executives, the clients. They were all discovering that the company did not truly own the software they had been selling, deploying, and updating for more than a decade. And the only person who could unlock, validate, and restore it was the woman they had called outdated. I leaned back, the room quiet and still, and for the first time since being fired, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. Their mistake was no longer just an insult, it was leverage. The next morning, before the sun even reached the blinds, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Tomas, sent from his personal number, which meant he had reached the point of desperation where risking his job felt safer than staying silent. Harper, you need to see this. Attached was a forwarded email chain, one I instantly recognized because I had been the original sender. It was dated 16 months earlier, right after I discovered the IP transfer had never been finalized. My message to leadership was polite, professional, and direct. We need to complete the Orion Core intellectual property handover. The system's ownership verification protocols may create issues if this remains pending. That was the warning. And right below it sat the reply I would never forget. From Lance Mercer, not a priority. Handle it after Q4. Focus on performance metrics instead. There it was, in black and white, the sentence that would eventually bring a $500 million platform to its knees. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a slow, simmering anger rise. Not loud, not explosive, but sharp and precise. He dismissed me. He dismissed the system. He dismissed the legal reality. And now he was paying the price not because I orchestrated anything, but because he ignored the very person who built the foundation his leadership was standing on. Tomas's next text came through moments later. Harper, I think they are trying to blame you. I almost smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. Of course they were. That was the predictable move. When a storm hits, inexperienced leaders look for someone to sacrifice. But the emailed timestamps, the archived warnings, the documented recommendations, they all pointed in one direction, and it was not me, it was Lance. I typed a short reply. Save everything. Do not delete a single file. He responded with a simple, already done. As I set my phone down, a quiet certainty settled in my chest. The narrative was shifting. The truth was surfacing. And the company was finally seeing what I had known all along. Firing me was not just careless. It was catastrophic. The documentation Tomas sent was no longer just evidence. It was the spark that would ignite the reckoning waiting behind every locked server and every angry client call. They wanted to call me outdated. Now they were discovering just how current my fingerprints still were on every part of their empire. By the afternoon, the tone of every message hitting my phone had shifted from frantic to pleading. Executives who had barely acknowledged me in the hallway were suddenly addressing me by first name, asking if we could open a constructive dialogue. Even Elena sent a long, carefully worded email that danced around responsibility and gently suggested a meeting to clarify ownership pathways. It was almost impressive how quickly panic could soften arrogance. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to rush in, calm the fire, restore their access, and hand over the keys they had never bothered to understand. But I was done offering my expertise for free. I was done saving people who did not think I mattered. So instead of replying, I called the one person I trusted to see this from 30,000 feet. My attorney, Mila Chen. Within an hour, she met me at my dining table, her laptop open, her eyes sharp with focus. She listened as I laid out everything: the forgotten transfer, the system lockout, the email chain proving Lance's negligence, the clause the legal team had rediscovered too late when I finished. She exhaled slowly and said, "Harper, they need you more than you need them. That means you set the terms." Together we drafted a response that was not emotional, not vindictive, but undeniably firm. I would restore access, yes, but not without a legally binding agreement. Mila typed the demands with the precision of someone carving them into stone. $110 million up front for a 4-year exclusive license to Orion Core, 15% royalties on all new enterprise deployments, a voting seat on the board, a public statement acknowledging my contributions, and the immediate removal of Lance Mercer as Chief Executive Officer. There was no apology in my request. There was no forgiveness clause. It was a corrective measure, one they had earned through years of dismissing the very foundation they depended on. When Mila finished typing, she turned the laptop toward me. "Are you sure this is everything you want?" I read the document twice, feeling the weight of every line. It was not greed. It was not revenge for the sake of revenge. It was accountability. It was value. It was overdue recognition for work they had taken for granted. I nodded. "Send it." Mila hit send without hesitation. The terms were out. The conversation had officially shifted, and the ball was no longer in their court. It was in mine. Where it should have been, all along. The company went silent for nearly 12 hours after Mila sent the proposal, and that silence told me everything. Behind those glass office walls, a storm was gathering. Executives were scrambling, lawyers were arguing, board members were demanding explanations that no one could give without implicating themselves, and somewhere in the mix, Lance was undoubtedly pacing, sweating, pointing fingers at anyone within reach. By sunrise the next day, the news broke. The board had called an emergency summit and flown in Graham Holt, the original founder, a man who had not stepped foot in the building in years but still carried the kind of authority that could flip an entire company upside down. When my phone rang and his name appeared on the screen, I answered on the second ring. "Harper," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Why am I hearing that we do not own our own platform?" I let him speak. I let him ask the questions. And then I told him everything, calmly and clearly, exactly as it happened: the forgotten transfer, the warnings, the lockout protocol, Lance's dismissal of the issue. Graham did not interrupt. He just listened, and with every detail, his silence grew heavier. When I finished, he exhaled like a man realizing the foundation of his legacy had been cracked by someone else's arrogance. "I am calling a meeting in 2 hours," he said, "and I want you on that video call." When the meeting began, I could see the tension across every face on the screen. The board members looked exhausted, Elena looked defeated, and Lance looked like a man still trying to pretend he was in control. Graham opened with a single statement: "We have failed to respect the architect of our own success." Then he turned to me. "Harper, explain the status of the system." I did, calmly, without embellishment, and with enough precision to make every executive realize how deep the problem ran without my authorization. "See," Lance attempted to cut in, throwing around words like protocol mismanagement and legacy vulnerabilities, but Graham shut him down with a look that could freeze water. Then came the moment the room tightened. Graham asked, "Did you ignore her warnings?" And Elena, with the weight of truth pressing down on her, slid the printed email chain onto the conference table. It felt like the entire board inhaled at once. Lance's own words. Not a priority. We're sitting in front of them like a confession. The founder turned to him, his voice low and unwavering. You fired the one person who owns the product. There was no debate. No second vote needed. The board terminated Lance's employment immediately and unanimously. When the call ended, I sat in my quiet living room for a moment, letting the reality settle. They had spent years underestimating me. Now they finally understood. And the next steps. They would be entirely on my terms. The following morning, just after dawn, I received the official acceptance of every term in my proposal. No edits. No negotiations. No softened language. The board agreed to the full $110 million up front, the royalties, the board seat, the public acknowledgement, and Lance's immediate removal. It felt surreal, not because they accepted, but because they finally understood the value they had thrown away so carelessly. I closed the email, folded my laptop, and allowed myself a long, steady breath. This was not triumph born from spite. This was balance being restored. 2 days later, I walked back into the building with a temporary visitor badge clipped to my jacket. A badge that would soon be replaced with something far more permanent. Employees watched me with a mix of relief, guilt, and awe, their whispers trailing behind me as I moved through the halls that once felt like a second home. The tension was gone, replaced by something softer, almost reverent. When I reached the operations floor, Tomas stood up from his desk the moment he saw me. He did not say anything dramatic. He simply nodded, and I returned the gesture. It was enough. Graham greeted me at the glass conference room, holding a fresh badge in his hand. "Welcome back, Harper," he said, placing it in my palm. The badge shimmered with the blue outlining reserved only for board-level access. "We should have never let you go." His voice carried sincerity, not corporate polish. I appreciated that. We stepped into the room where the entire leadership team waited, and for the first time in a long time, every eye looked at me not with skepticism or dismissal, but with respect. Real respect. After the formalities, I walked to my old workspace, now untouched since the day I left. I placed my bag down, logged into the system, and re-authenticated the ownership keys with a single command. Orion Core recognized me instantly. The dashboards lit up one by one, the lockouts dissolved, and the system hummed back to life as if it had been holding its breath waiting for my return. A quiet ripple of applause echoed from the corner of the room. I did not turn around, but I smiled. In that moment, the resentment I once carried finally eased. Not because they apologized, not because they paid, but because I stood there as the architect of my own legacy. No longer invisible, no longer underestimated. I had my voice back. My value back. My seat at the table back. And the platform I built was once again in the hands of the person who understood it best. As the lights of Orion Core flickered into full glow, I felt something deep and steady settle in my chest. I did not come back for revenge. I came back to reclaim what was mine. And I did. If there is one thing I learned from this entire experience, it is that silence is not weakness. Expertise is not replaceable, and calling someone outdated does not erase the years they spent carrying something no one else understood. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not anger, not chaos, and not retaliation. It is simply reclaiming what was always yours and letting the truth speak louder than any title or dismissal ever could. So let me ask you, after hearing my story, what would you have done in my place? Would you have walked away quietly? Would you have fought back? Or would you have waited, calmly, for the system to reveal who was truly necessary? Share your thoughts. Share your experiences. And if you are carrying your own quiet worth, your own overlooked brilliance, I hope my story reminds you of this. Sometimes you are not being replaced. Sometimes you are simply being underestimated. And those who underestimate you always learn, one way or another,